All right, today's lecture is on tissues, and we're going to do first what tissues are and the four main types of tissues, and then we're going to get into epithelial tissue, what they are, and then the first three types of the epithelial tissue that we're going to cover. All right, so let's get started. The definition of any tissue, no matter if it's any of these four types that you see listed below, is just a group of cells that work together for some kind of function. So a group of cells that work together for a role, to do a job in the body. And there are only four tissues in the body. There is epithelial, which we'll cover first, muscle, nervous, and connective. And we're going to do epithelial first, and I'm going to teach all the others individually. So let's just focus on what epithelial tissue is. The stem epi means upon, and so you will find epithelial tissue upon surfaces in the body. That surface can be exposed to the outside, like your skin, or that surface can be exposed to the inside. Think about the parietal pleura, for example, like we did in the last unit. That parietal pleura was exposed to a cavity, the thoracic cavity or the pleural cavity of your body. It can also cover the inner surface of an organ. Think about your intestines. It's nothing more than just a tube. That inner lining of that tube is also epithelial tissue. So anything that covers a surface is going to be epithelial. And we'll do the others as we move throughout the unit. When you look at tissue slides and when we see pictures from a microscope on the screen, they've gone through a series of steps in order to get the perfect image. And sometimes it's not perfect, but to see those pictures, the body has to be sliced, or the organ has to be sliced extremely thinly, and then they will fix it, meaning that they kind of preserve it in the state that it's in. It will be stained with various stains that most of the time will appear pink and purple. And then it's put onto a microscope slide so that you can see it. Now, some of them are not perfect, but the ones that I try to give you are the best images of that type of tissue. And there will be a section on the test and quizzes that you have to identify the tissue, you have to identify the slide, you have to look at that picture and say, well, I know where the cell is. I know that here's the nucleus. Does it have some cellular extensions? What am I looking at in those images? And we'll go through that individually as we look at all the tissue types. Again, we're just going to work with epithelial for now, but epithelial tissue does cover a surface, and that covering helps create boundaries in the body. Remember, that was one of the important aspects that we covered in the beginning unit, is that there's a boundary between inner and outer, or there's a boundary between visceral and parietal, and that helps to protect things. That helps to secrete or to make fluids for the body. You can also absorb things and nutrients and oxygen and all of that through epithelial tissue. You can also filter, and so the functions of epithelial tissue are different, but remember, those functions are always related to the structure. When we look at these four types of tissues, the first thing I'm going to do is outline one cell from each of the types. Okay, so I'm just going to take my pencil here and go around the cell membrane as best I can. And this cell membrane is going to hold everything in. Remember, you can't have a cell without a cell membrane. And as I get one cell from each of the four types of tissues of the body outlined, I hope you will notice that these cells have very different shapes. And if they have different shapes or different anatomy, then they should have different functions. Let's take a muscle cell first. Muscle cells are very long. Okay, the terminology is elongated, and this one is cylindrical. It also has more than one nucleus. So if I draw in the nucleus, I can see that the nucleus in a muscle cell is here, and here, and here. Okay, so that means that this one is multinucleated. And then we compare that to the nervous tissue over here. That cell looks very different. It's very star-shaped, has a lot of branching pattern to it. Here's the nucleus of the neuron, much bigger than a muscle cell. Therefore, nervous tissue doesn't act like muscle tissue. It's not made to do that. The two that are most similar are connective tissue and epithelial tissue. Still composed of a lot of cells in either picture you see. Here's the nucleus of the connective tissue cell, and here's the nucleus of the epithelial cell. Have a similar shape, but you'll notice that epithelial cells, or epithelial tissue rather, or in epithelial tissue, the cells are all packed together. There's no space between them. Whereas in connective tissue, I have one purple cell here. There's a little bit of space before I get the next purple cell. A little bit of space before I get the next purple cell. And so in connective tissue, there will be this spacing or a sporadic pattern of the cells, whereas in epithelial, these cells are going to connect to one another with like a Velcro or a glue, and that's going to help epithelial tissue form a sheet. And if you go back to the overall function of epithelial tissue is to cover a surface, well then it needs to be a sheet. So think about saran wrap. You don't want your holes in the saran wrap. So you got to have all those cells together to form that sheet, to form that wrapping wherever it may be in the body. Okay, so we're going to go over general characteristics of all epithelial tissue. So there will be 6 kinds of epithelial tissue, and we're going to do 3 today. But all 6 fit these rules. And so no matter what type of connective or epithelial tissue we're looking at, they should all follow this same general pattern. They do come in 2 forms. It either covers the body surface, which is what we talked about just a second ago, or epithelial tissue is the major tissue of glands. Okay, and go back in your brain and think, what are glands? I have sweat glands, saliva glands, oil glands, and then I have endocrine glands, things like my pancreas or my thymus or my thyroid. Okay, so no matter what type of gland we're looking at, glands are going to be made of epithelial tissue. They also have a polarity, and when you see polarity, I want you to think about poles, and poles mean sides. There's a top and there's a bottom to epithelial tissue. The top is called the apical surface. The bottom is called the basal surface, and the bottom of that epithelial tissue is always, always, always anchored to connective tissue. Okay, epithelial tissue cannot exist by itself. Okay, it has to be supported, anchored, glued to, whatever you want to think about, connective tissue. It has to have a buddy, and its buddy is connective tissue. I'm going to draw a quick little epithelial picture so you have an idea in your mind of what I'm talking about. So we're going to have what I call the epithelial strip or the epithelial chunk. Okay, and this epithelial chunk may be any of the 6 types, but generally speaking, you'll have your epithelial chunk on the top. And again, this cannot exist alone. So it has to have a buddy underneath. And there's a small section in between called the basement membrane. It's kind of what's going to be in yellow here. And this basement membrane is going to anchor the epithelial tissue to the connective tissue underneath. Okay, so this is your connective tissue. It's like a sandwich. Okay. Now, this basement membrane has to be sticky because it has to, the yellow is the basement membrane, and it has to be sticky, and it has to attach epithelial to connective. But it also has to be permeable, which we'll look at in a second. Permeability is just the ability to pass things through. Okay. Now, epithelial tissue form sheets. How does it form a sheet? How do cells stick together? And the individual epithelial cells have specialized junctions and contacts with one another that help those cells adhere together. And so these specialized contacts will help epithelial tissue form sheets. Okay, the next thing about all epithelial tissue is that it is avascular. And the stem A means without, and the stem, or the word vascular, means blood vessel. And so epithelial tissue does not have any blood vessels. Okay, it cannot have blood vessels because of its need to stick together and its need to form sheets. But it also means, well, if I don't have blood vessels, then how do I survive? And so the connective tissue underneath will have blood vessels that give the epithelial tissue on the top the nourishment that's necessary. The last thing about epithelial tissue is that it has to regenerate readily, meaning that as cells are being, or as cells are falling off, or as cells are dying within this epithelial area, they have to replace themselves, and they have to replace themselves quickly. And so that's one property that's different about epithelial tissue that may not be the same for connective, and definitely not the same for nervous, and definitely not the same for muscle tissue. Epithelial tissue has a really good turnover rate. It's very mitotic, whereas connective tissue, it takes a while. It also can form scar tissue. Muscle tissue really doesn't regenerate very well. Nervous tissue doesn't regenerate at all. And so that's unique to epithelial tissue. When we look at this picture, this is a picture version of what we just went over. Okay, so the first thing I want to look at is this idea, this sandwich idea of epithelial tissue on the top and connective tissue on the bottom. Here, wrong way, here is the same thing. We've got epithelial tissue up here on the top. We've got connective tissue down here at the bottom. This hypothetical region between the two, and this very tiny little section right here, is the basement membrane. Again, that basement membrane is permeable, meaning that it will allow some things to go through and others not, so selectively permeable. And it's also sticky, okay, because its purpose is to adhere or stick these two types of tissue together. The next thing we can notice is, what are all these hairy cellular extensions on the top of the cells? Okay, I only see 3 cells here. Okay, I'm going to kind of circle them. Cell 1 is right here, cell 2, and cell 3. I see the nuclei down here at the bottom. And then I've got all of these weird extensions at the top. There are 2 types of cellular extensions that you will see in epithelial tissue. I don't know of a tissue that has both. And so this is just an overview of what you might see. Okay, the ones that we're going to do first are cilia. Okay, cilia propel and cilia move. Okay, they are also longer than these over here, which are microvilli. Okay, the purpose of cilia is to sweep. Okay, they will move mucus along. Think about when you have a nasty cough, and it just sounds like that mucus is just kind of, you're hacking up along. You're trying to get it out. Okay, those cilia are working in overdrive to try to move that mucus along if you have a cold. With microvilli, okay, they do not move. They might look like they should, but they do not move, and they are short. And their purpose is absorption. Okay, so you would think about having microvilli in areas where you need to soak something in. The best example I can give you right now is in intestine. I need to absorb all the nutrients possible out of my food. So as food is moving along through the digestive system, instead of it just scooting across the top of the cells, it can go through every little roller coaster, mountain and valley, and absorb more nutrients. Okay, Okay, that's the overall purpose of microvilli versus cilia. I want to highlight that this is the apical side of the epithelial tissue. Remember that apical just means that it's the top. Okay, it's the area that is exposed to a space. If this is the intestine, this is where your food's going to be traveling along. So this is the top. The bottom is the basal region, and that basal region is at the base or at the bottom, near the basement or near the connective tissue underneath. And the purpose of all of these cell junctions that you see is for epithelial tissue to form a sheet. Okay, all of these connections between the cells that you see, desmosomes, tight junctions, and adhesive belt. Don't worry about the differences between those. Just understand that all of those cell connections and cell junctions give the ability to that epithelial tissue to form sheets, for these cells to all stick together. Let me touch on one more thing. Blood vessels. Okay, epithelial tissue is avascular. I don't see any blood vessels within those cells, but I do notice a capillary down here in the connective tissue. That capillary is a blood vessel, a type of blood vessel in your body. And so what will happen is, as nourishment needs to get up into the epithelial tissue, or oxygen, it will diffuse out of that capillary through this basement membrane and then up into the epithelial above. So that gives you two general properties of epithelial tissue. One, it's avascular, and two, it helps you understand that that basement region or that basement membrane has to be permeable. If it wasn't, then this epithelial tissue would not get the nutrients that it needs. All right, we're going to skip over this one, and go to this page here. Okay, so your basement membrane is nothing more than a combination of proteins. Okay, it is not a cell. It's not composed of its own little mini layer of cells. It's just sticky proteins, and that's all I want you to really know. That is selectively permeable, and it's kind of like double-sided tape that will stick the epithelial to the connective and the connective to the epithelial. All right, before we talk about the different types of individual epithelial cells and epithelial tissue, we're going to look at some naming properties for epithelial tissue. And it's kind of similar to what we did with membranes, in that we have a first name and a last name. The two options for the first name are either simple or stratified. And if a epithelial tissue is simple, then it is only one layer thick, meaning that it does not have cells stacked on top of one another. It's just one tiny little cell that's going to be joined in with their neighboring cells, and it will go side by side by side by side. If we look at these examples of simple epithelia up here at the top, it's got one cell, then another one, then another one, then another one. Okay, there are no cells on top of one another as you would see in the one below. If an epithelium is stratified, then it is more than one layer thick. So greater than one layer thick. And there will be different cells, or more than one layer of cells stacked on top of one another. If we look at this one that's stratified cuboidal, we've got one layer here and we got one layer here. Okay, this is still just the epithelial section. All of these would still be anchored to the connective tissue underneath. The second name you'll give epithelial tissue is based on shape. And so we've got layers and shapes. If it is squamous, then it is going to be a scale shape. So it's going to have some kind of fish scale-like appearance, something like this, and it has a nucleus. Okay, if we look here, this is a squamous shaped cell, kind of like a fish scale. Here's another one that is in stratified squamous. Okay, so we have simple squamous versus stratified squamous. One layer of scale-shaped cells versus many layers of scale-shaped cells on top of one another. The second shape is cuboidal. Okay, and cuboidal cells look like a cube. They're kind of just this rounded cube shape. And most of the time, the nucleus of a cuboidal cell will be right in the center, and it has a spherical shape, or it is round and in the center. You can see here's one simple cuboidal cell. Here's stratified cuboidal, which would be more than one layer of cuboidal cells. And the last one is columnar. Okay, and columnar cells are long and skinny like a column. And the nucleus of a columnar cell is generally in the middle or close to that basal surface, close to the bottom or in the center. Okay, so these are your three shape options, and then we will pick, is it one layer or is it more than one layer? The first one we need to do is simple squamous. Okay, simple squamous, just from looking at the name, should be one layer of scale cells. And those scale cells should be thin, should be flat, as would be expected if it has a scaly shape. So the description can be predicted just from the name of the tissue. Examples are going to be the locations where you will have simple squamous in the body. Two areas of your body that have simple squamous epithelium is the air sacs of your lungs and the walls of your capillaries. Okay, in both of those areas, think logically. I don't want to have gas exchange through a whole lot of cells. I would rather move carbon dioxide out and oxygen in through one cell versus 100 cells. So it would make sense that you have this in your lungs because it is easier for your body to move oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients, whatever needs to pass through a membrane or through a wall of tissue if it was tiny. And so that's kind of how you should think about it. Structure is always going to go with function. Your body's going to work smarter, not harder. Same thing would be true with capillaries. Purpose of a capillary is to move things across the wall. Okay, inside capillaries are blood. Inside blood is everything you need. All the nutrients, all the oxygen, everything that your body's going to use. So again, your body's going to want to move things across small, one-layered cells, tiny scale cells, versus a stratified epithelium. The function of simple squamous, filtration. Okay, I'm filtering things across that tiny layer of cells. Diffusion, the movement of particles across the tissue. And osmosis, the movement of water. Okay, now the specialized names I don't want you to stress about too much, but I do want you to notice serous membranes here. Okay, you should probably ring a bell somewhere in your brain that I've seen serous membranes before. They made serous fluid, and then we gave them names like visceral peritoneum or parietal peritoneum. So those body membranes that we did last unit were actually just tiny layers of scale-shaped cells on the surface of the organ or on the surface of the cavity itself. When I look at a picture of simple squamous, most of the time, the picture is going to be a top view of simple squamous. Because the cells are so tiny and because they are nearly invisible, if you're looking at them from the side, you're going to take a picture of simple squamous as if you're like droning over it and taking a screenshot of it. And so that may appear stratified. Okay, because you can make an argument that there's a layer of cells here and a layer of cells here and a layer of cells here. But with simple squamous, and typically with only simple squamous, you will be looking at it from the top. Let's identify what the cell is and where it is in this picture. Okay, most of you are going to want to look for the nucleus first. Okay, you know that's where the cell is. So this is a more clear image of simple squamous, and it's also zoomed in a little bit more than this one over here. But this black outline is the cell membrane. Your nucleus is in the center. Same thing over here. The outline is the cell membrane, and the nucleus would be within each cell. You also have cytoplasm. Okay, and that cytoplasm is going to fill the space between all the organelles and all the other cellular components. Okay, now if you're going to look at simple squamous from the side, you can barely see the cell. Okay, so think about looking at the side of a fish and taking a picture versus looking at it from the side or looking at it from a transverse section. You would be the cell would be so tiny it would be hard to see. The next type is simple cuboidal. So just from the name, you would expect it to be one layer of cube-shaped cells. And this one's weird. It may not always be side by side by side. Okay, so it's probably not going to look like simple squamous in that the cells are all next door to one another. Okay, what will happen with simple cuboidal is that these individual cells like to form a circle. So instead of it being side by side by side, let me get this out of the way, maybe not, let me erase it. Instead of them being side by side by side, they are going to be first anchored to a basement membrane. So I'm going to draw my basement membrane there. And then my individual cuboidal cells, try to draw it as best I can with a mouse here, are going to organize themselves in a ring. Okay, just like this. Around, 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 around. Okay, so each one of the yellows is a simple cuboidal cell, and those simple cuboidal cells like to be arranged like so. Okay, so not perfect, but you get my point. Okay, now that creates connective tissue out here. So all back here will be the connective tissue. This will be my basement membrane. This is my epithelial chunk, okay, in a circle. It also creates this open area in the middle. Okay, so what we're going to do now is kind of transfer this idea down into these pictures. And these are different magnifications. This is 400 times magnified. This is probably 100. Okay, so what you're looking for are these circles. This is what you should try to envision down here on these two tissue pictures. And I'm going to do my best to outline one down here in this picture. Okay, so this would be my basement membrane, like so. And each one of these individual cells is right here. Okay, and they would go around in a circle. Okay, that's the idea for simple cuboidal. Over here on this other one, it's more zoomed in, so you would expect the circle to be bigger. So here's one cuboidal cell, and it's going to form a circle, and here is kind of the basement membrane, like so. Okay, now this space in the center is going to help you understand the function. The function of simple cuboidal tissue is going to be secretion and absorption. Secretion means to make or to spit out. If you look at the location, it makes sense. My glands. What do glands do? Well, they make saliva, they make sweat, they make hormones, they make oil. They secrete those things. The individual cells will make a secretion and will kind of spit out that secretion into this space, into this hole, into this hole. Okay, but what's cool is that they can also go the other direction. They can also absorb. So it's two ideas of getting rid of or taking it back, secreting or absorbing. In the ovaries, okay, we're going to be making estrogen. In the kidney tubules, which are tiny tubes within the kidney, your kidney has simple cuboidal cells that say, okay, I want to get rid of this from my blood to make urine, but I want to hang on to the salt, for a better example. Okay, so instead of getting rid of that excess salt, I'm going to absorb it back into those simple cuboidal cells, back into the bloodstream, so I can use it for later. So there's this back and forth action of simple cuboidal cells that's pretty unique. Let's look at one more picture of it. This is very zoomed in, but so clean. You can see the individual simple cuboidal cells. You can see that they're forming a circle. Here is your nucleus. We have the cell membrane here, and then this open space. Okay, the little swimming pool looking area in the center is called a lumen. And a lumen in the body is a hole, or the inner space of a tube. If you think about your intestine, it's got a hole or a tubular shape running through the center. That is a lumen. Glands are going to be the same way. Saliva glands are going to make the saliva. It's going to push it out into this hole, and eventually all those holes are going to come together. All those tubes are going to come together and empty out under my tongue or in various places in my mouth. The last one for the simple epithelia is simple columnar. Again, based on the name, you should predict the shape. Simple means one layer. Columnar should be column shaped. And all simple columnar cells will be attached to one another because remember, they like to form sheets, or epithelial tissue will form sheets. And they're just long and skinny versus a cube shape or versus a scale shape. That one looks a little big, but that's okay. So if we were to predict what it would look like, this would be my epithelial strip. We'd have my basement membrane underneath, and then the connective tissue. Okay, and that connective tissue always anchors the epithelial tissue. Simple columnar will also have microvilli. Okay, microvilli are those tiny little cellular extensions on the top that are there for absorption of nutrients. If I'm trying to absorb nutrients, then that should say, oh, that should be in the intestines and that should be in the stomach. Okay, I got to absorb those nutrients. I got to get everything possible out of the food that I put in my body. It also lines the uterus. Okay, and the function of that is important, or the function of protection is important because of the shedding of the lining of the uterus each month. When you look at the nuclei of simple columnar cells, they should all line up with one another. It'd be like if I could lay my pencil down on the screen and cover up the majority of the nucleus, the nuclei. Tomorrow we'll look at another type of tissue where the nuclei are all over the place and they're kind of in a zigzag pattern. So one way to distinguish between simple columnar and the other type is to look at those nuclei and see if are they all kind of lined up with one another. SpongeBob here went to Glove World on one of the episodes, and the science nerd in me said, oh, it kind of looks like microvilli on the top. Okay, again, they don't move and they're short. Every once in a while, in simple columnar, you will have a cell added in called a goblet cell. And it has a goblet shape to it, something similar to this. Okay, kind of looks like a wine glass. And the nucleus will still kind of line up with its neighboring nuclei. And within that goblet cell, you're going to have a mucus droplet. And that mucus droplet will make mucus once it mixes with water. And it'll spread that mucus out along the tissue to help move things around. This is a goblet cell in a tissue slide. Not quite as goblet shaped, but still looks different than a long and skinny simple columnar cell. When we look at an image of simple columnar, the first thing I want you to notice are these nuclei that are all lined up. You can also notice that the cells are long and skinny. And there's some of the easiest ones to identify. Right here, we've got a pretty clear image of the epithelial strip versus the connective tissue underneath. And so the area between epithelial cells and connective cells, remember, is your basement membrane. Under the basement membrane is going to be your connective tissue. The nucleus is here. Okay, they all kind of line up. At the top of the simple columnar cell, you will have microvilli. Now, it's not very obvious, and it may even seem invisible, but I promise it's there. Because microvilli are so small, they're not going to look like big old extensions at the top of the cell. It's going to appear like this. Okay, this is a more obvious image of microvilli. It just looks like a blurred line across the top of the tissue. So I promise it's there, and if it's simple columnar, it will have microvilli. So there's not going to be an instance where it doesn't. And here, you don't have a goblet cell, and in some pictures you won't, but in this one, there's your goblet cell. Okay, so it's kind of interspersed. Every once in a while, there'll be a goblet cell mixed in, so depending on where you take the picture, you may not see it. Here's the nucleus of the goblet cell. The mucus itself and some of the cytoplasm does not absorb the stain, so that's why it appears white. Because it doesn't absorb all of the stain like the columnar cells on either side.